Hello and welcome to the Swayam MOOCs on Economics of Gender and Development. In today's lecture, we will study about feminist economics in policy and practice. Now, so far, what we have been doing is a theoretical critique of mainstream economics, but today, let us move into a different terrain, which is how feminists actually enter policies, development programs, and measurement frameworks. In other words, we are asking how do feminist insights change the way governments, international agencies, and development institutions design policies? How do they change what we count, what we measure, and what we value? And this is where feminist economics becomes not just an academic exercise, but a political and practical intervention. Now, let me begin by telling you that the way development institutions have thought about women has not been static. It has evolved significantly over the last 5 to 6 decades. And therefore, it is important for us to begin understanding some of the theoretical perspectives on how women have changed, how thinking about women have changed in a number of ways. Earlier, women were treated as an undifferentiated category. The assumption was that all women are the same, all women are poor, and all women are victims. But feminist scholars and gender analysts have challenged this, and generally the focus has now shifted from simply women to relationships between women and men. Now, this is a very important shift because instead of asking what are women doing, we begin to ask how are power relations between men and women structured. And this shift leads to a shift in thinking from women in development to gender and development. We think about not just a single role of women as reproducers, but about the triple role of women, that is, roles of reproductive, productive, and community management work. We are also moving from practical gender needs to strategic gender needs. We have stopped looking at women only as victims to women as actors and agents, and we are moving from a top down to a bottom up perspective. And this unit of analysis changes the emphasis on individual women to and the household to socially and ethnically distinct groups of women and men and the relations between them. Now, this is where feminist economics becomes extremely powerful because mainstream economics, as we have already discussed, traditionally recognized only the productive work or the paid productive work, and the other two were treated as non economic. As I said, we also see a shift from practical gender needs to strategic gender needs. Practical gender needs mostly refers to needs about survival, so food, water, shelter, income, and so on. But strategic needs are about power and transformation, rights, mobility, control over resources, freedom from violence, and so on. Similarly, women are no longer seen only as victims but also as agents and actors, and this is a major epistemic shift. And finally, as I said, the unit of analysis changes because we are moving from looking at the individual women or household to looking at socially differentiated groups of women by caste, class, ethnicity, location, and the relations between them. And this is a deeply feminist move because it rejects the idea of a universal woman. So, what we will cover in today's lecture, I have divided it into four parts. First, we'll discuss about this shift in perspective from women in development to gender mainstreaming or gender equality. Then we'll look at gender analysis and approaches to gender mainstreaming. There is a lot of progress that has happened worldwide across countries with regard to different policy frameworks in gender mainstreaming. We will touch upon some of those aspects. We'll also look at some of the gender sensitive indicators that helps us to measure and assess poverty and power and what are the discussions in this domain. And finally, I'll end today's lecture with the contesting perspectives about mainstreaming and women's empowerment. Now, let us focus on the first part where we have moved from a perspective shift with regard to focusing only on women in development towards gender mainstreaming. Now, this the changing approaches to women in development basically illustrates the interdependence between theories and methods. The early WID approach was based on a very simple idea, and that is that women are left out of development, so let us include them. So projects were designed like sewing training for women, income generation schemes for women, microcredit activities for women, and so on. Now, while these were important, feminists like Naila Kabir, Geeta Sen, Mary Anderson pointed out that inclusion alone does not challenge power structures. You can give women sewing machines, but if they have no control over income, over mobility, they have no bargaining power, then have we really empowered them? So, this critique led us to an approach called gender and development, which looked at structures, institutions, and power relations, and not just women's participation. The Beijing Action for Platform for Action 1995 is a landmark moment. It clearly states that gender equality is the goal and mainstreaming gender equality is the strategy. So, therefore, this is crucial because gender equality is not just a woman's issue, it becomes a core development goal. And gender mainstreaming means integrating gender concerns into all policies, all programs, all institutions, and all resource allocations. So, instead of having a small women's desk in one ministry, the idea is that every ministry, finance, agriculture, transport, urban development, must think about gender. So it is in this sense that the Beijing conference, the 1995 conference, the Beijing Platform for Action, came up with a global agreement that gender equality is the goal. And this is where the perspective shifted from simply highlighting on women and all women to the power relations between men and women and others. So the gender discourse transitioned from women in development to gender and development. Now, the gender mainstreaming has uh, has various strategies, but when we look at strategizing gender mainstreaming, there are two perspectives that needs understanding. Now, one is mainstreaming into existing structures. This is about adding gender components to existing projects, inserting gender checklists, or including women as beneficiaries. And this is also sometimes called the integrationist approach. But the other perspective is about agenda setting. And this is a more transformative approach. This is a much more radical approach because here the idea is that let us question the very assumption of development, growth, productivity, labor markets, and households. So this approach asks, why is care work invisible? Why are labor markets structured in male centric ways? Why is unpaid work excluded from national income accounts, and so on? So this is where feminist economics is at its strongest. It does not just add women, it redefines the system. So, in a nutshell, when we are looking at gender mainstreaming, we need to approach it very cautiously because there are many aspects, many perspectives to gender mainstreaming. The two that I have highlighted here is about mainstreaming strategies, which is basically incorporating gender policies into conventional project and program work. But the other is about agenda setting, which is a more transformative aspect, which is a more transformational aspect of how we can create strategies that can create the conditions under which men and women can challenge conventional patterns and structural inequalities. And this is where we start to redefine gender initiatives. Now, let us come to gender analysis. There are different policy approaches to world women. Gender analysis is not just about collecting data on women, as we have been discussing so far. It is about understanding who does what, who owns what, who decides what, and who benefits. So, gender analysis examines division of labor, access to resources, control over resources, and so on. Now, let me show you how various scholars have particularly taken from Moser in a study on from the 1980s, how the understanding about women in development and gender and development has changed over a period of time. Now, if you look at the period of the 1950s to 1970s, the idea was that we are focusing on social welfare, the residual model of social welfare under colonial administration. There was modernization, accelerated growth, economic development model. But slowly we moved from a welfareism aspect to the equity aspect, and this is where the we pin the original WID approach, which is failure of modernization, the influence of Esther Boserup and first world feminists on various amendments, declaration of UN Decade for Women. Towards the 1980s, we moved towards anti poverty programs. This is the second WID approach. Here, we had a toned down equity because of criticisms, and issues were linked to redistribution with growth and basic needs. Towards the 1990s, neoliberalism and the opening up of markets in different countries, the third world women and their development became predominant in the WID approach, or the women in development approach. And more recently, we have been focusing on empowerment, where and this mostly arose because of the failure of equity approach. And the third world women's feminist writing and grassroots organizations have been at the forefront in leading this idea. Now, which is the period that was most popular with respect to the WID approach? 1950s to 70s, which is still widely used. Post 19 mid 1970s, that were attempt to adopt WID approach during and since the women's decades. From the 1970s onwards, we had limited popularity of the WID approach, and from the 1980s onwards, we started moving towards more of a gender and development approach. Now, if you look at the purpose of the WID approach, the purpose essentially to bring women into development as better mothers. The welfareism aspect of development mostly focused on this. But when we started looking at equity gains, women became integral to the development process. And then anti-poverty programs started focusing on ensuring that poor women increase their productivity, and slowly we started moving towards more efficient use of resources when we are putting women at the center, and then towards empowering women through greater self-reliance and so on. Now, for effective gender mainstreaming, we need clear policies and priorities, gender analysis tools and frameworks, specific gender equality goals, and monitoring and reporting systems, dialogue with civil society, and so on. And this is where institutions often fail. They may adopt the language of gender, but without resources, training, or accountability, it becomes tokenistic. Now, let us focus a little on what is the purpose of gender analysis in the context of gender mainstreaming. The purpose of gender analysis is basically to understand the mechanism underlying dominant development problems and policy, program and project interventions, and what impact it has on women and men and relationship between them. As I said, for effective gender mainstreaming, we need to have clear policies and priorities at national and international levels. Gender mainstreaming strategies and gender analysis methods, we need to have a reasonable level of gender analysis specific to an intervention. There need to be one or more clear goals relating to changes in gender equality, and there has to be some means of monitoring, evaluation, and reporting on the changes in gender equality with identifiable links to intervention. Now, and this is where institutions often lack or fail in prioritizing institutional goals. The language of gender may be adopted, but there are insufficient resources, training, and accountability to ensure that gender mainstreaming actually takes place. Now, gender mainstreaming also requires capacity. If you look at resources and capacity in terms of resources, we need human resources. For example, you need trained personnel, gender experts, you need gender units of focal points, and sex disaggregated data. Now, human resources may be internal or external to an organization, but we have to make optimal use of national or local gender expertise. Similarly, for own and partner agencies, staff, general issues on gender, including new topics such as masculinities and femininities, needs to be introduced. Gender analysis tools, gender analytical frameworks, checklists, handbooks, etc., need to be integrated as part of the training exercise of the institutions that one is working on. There are various kinds of stakeholder analysis that needs to be carried out, and identification of actors. For example, who are the beneficiaries of a particular intervention program, the partner agencies who are working together to benefit the final beneficiaries. There are different kinds of coordination officers, consultants, etc. All of them need to be gender sensitive to be able to take an intervention through. Similarly, when there is an intervention program in place, there are various kinds of institutional arrangements that need to be worked out. from the national to the local program. Example, you need to create different kinds of gender units, gender focal points. People who are involved or engaged in coordinating these different institutional arrangements also need to be trained adequately to understand the gender sensitive focal points and take the intervention forward. One of the important lacunae in terms of gender mainstreaming, which I have highlighted in the earlier classes as well, is the lack of sex disaggregated data and information, which is actually paramount to assess change in gender equality. And this is also where feminist economists challenge national statistical systems, and they ask, why is unpaid work not measured? Why is care time not counted? Why are women subsidiary activities ignored, and so on? And this directly links to our earlier lectures on production boundary and national accounts. Now, there are various gender analytical frameworks that have been worked out. And I have given out a few lists of gender analytical frameworks that have been operationalized in different country contexts. And those of you who are interested in taking gender analytical frameworks into research can may find this listing of frameworks very useful. For example, we have Harvard Analytical Framework, where the focus is on resource allocations for women and men. And here, the simple tools have been put into practice. For example, creating activity profiles, understanding the access and control profile to resources and benefits for women and what women and men, and what are the influencing factors. So this kind of analytical frameworks helps us to understand the differentiated outcomes that men and women face in certain local ecosystems. Similarly, there is people oriented planning, which is an adaptation of the Harvard Analytical Framework for use in refugee situations, for creating refugee population profile and context analysis. What are the activities that are carried out by the refugees in the refugee situation? The use of resources analysis and adaptation of Harvard tool for understanding women's socio-political profile compared to men's. This is also an analytical tool which has been operationalized in many country contexts. There is the Moser framework of gender analytical framework, where the contribution primarily is about women's triple role: reproductive, productive, and community work. Here we identify different gender roles. What are the triple roles that women play in their households, within the families, or at the community level? Then we understand, do a need assessment, gender needs assessment, and then we disaggregate control of resources and decision making. Moser's framework has been very widely used in the context of gender analysis, and it has come out to be one of the most important gender analytical frameworks for those studying resource allocation, keeping in mind women's multiple roles, the triple role of reproductive, productive, and community work. We also have gender analysis matrix, which is to determine the different impact development interventions have on women and men. This is also an analytical tool which has been carried out in development practice. Various development practitioners have used this analytical framework to for documenting women's participation in different activities at the grassroots level. The analysis here includes at four levels of society: women, men, household, and community. And the analysis of four kinds impact labor, time, resources, and sociocultural factors. We have also had capacities and vulnerabilities analysis framework, which helps in planning aid in emergencies and to meet immediate needs. Here, there is an additional dimension that is captured in this kind of a framework, which is to understand the complex reality within which vulnerabilities are occurring. And this is a more open kind of a framework, which has also been operationalized in many country contexts. We also have the Women's Empowerment Framework, which analyzes equality by sectors but concentrates on separate areas of social life. And here we look at the different measures on levels of equality, women's empowerment, and so on. There's a social relations approach which has also been used as a gender analytical framework, where the focal area is to analyze existing gender inequalities in distribution of resources, responsibilities, and power. This is mostly inspired by sense capability approach, where the framework focuses on ability to exercise choice. Also, Naila Kabir's ideas on resources, agencies, and framework. And this framework is useful for conceptualizing, studying, and implementing women's empowerment. So these are a few frameworks that are useful for studying gender sensitive or carrying out gender sensitive analysis in local contexts. Learners who are interested in carrying out research or dissertation in this area may look up further into these frameworks and develop their tools accordingly. Now, there are various kind of gender stereotypes that also needs to be challenged when we are looking at the policy framework of gender mainstreaming. And the challenging of these stereotypical assumptions can be made by planners about the household. Now, one is when you have at the household level the structure of low income households, the assumption is that it is nuclear. But the empirical and methodological challenge is that there are a high proportion of household structures which have extended families, women headed households, and often this imagination of a household constituting of a male headed household, and along with them child units and other adult units, may face a roadblock when we are analyzing, when we come up with these assumptions and we want to study gender relations in a local context. Even in very low income households, we find extended households or extended families. Now, I'll give you an example here. In common parlance, when we are looking at the definition of a household, one that is followed by the Census of India as well, is that a household is defined. The definitional idea of a household is one where all members of a household share the same kitchen. But if you look at the organization of families and family structures within India, within different locations in India, you would see that even if the kitchen is shared, there are many other assets within the household that are not shared, but at the same time the benefits accrue to all members of the household equally or unequally. For example, there may be land assets, there may be other resources which are being utilized equally by the households, and so there may be dependencies, various kinds of dependencies of different extended members of the family within the household. So when we are faced with this kind of a situation, how do we then analyze the household, because the household often becomes the unit of analysis. Similarly, the organization of tasks in the household. The assumption is that we have a man as a breadwinner and the woman is a housewife. But when we look closely, we see that women and men are involved in different roles depending on their gender division of labor in the local context. There are multiple roles that women are playing, and similarly, there are multiple roles that men are also playing. And with the passage of time, the roles are also changing, and therefore we need to be very time specific and context specific when we are looking at the organization of tasks within the household. The organization of tasks within the household in the urban setup and the rural setup have also changed. There are different kinds of role reversals that are taking place within the family setup, and here we need to carry out more research to understand, to challenge these gender stereotypes. Similarly, within the household, the control of resources and decision making. The assumption is that usually everybody has equal access to resources and that there is harmonious gender relations in the household, and therefore household is treated as a unit. Uh, Now, the irony is that despite the fact that we realize that households are heterogeneous and they are not necessarily a site of cooperation and there is conflict, we do find studies, particularly in the domain of economics, where we continue to treat household as a unit of production or consumption and base our entire analysis on it. However, we need to challenge this stereotype because empirical evidences tell us that often there is unequal access to resources for different household members, and therefore gender relations are extremely conflicting. So, we need to have disaggregated data at the household level. This is also a part of gender mainstreaming. We cannot be talking about gender mainstreaming as a policy unless and until we challenge these gender stereotypes at the household level. Now, after having spoken about gender mainstreaming as a policy instrument, and what are the different challenges that we face, and what are the different changes in perspectives that need to be carried out, let us move towards measurement issues, which is very close to feminist economics, because we have already understood that traditional indicators, for example, GDP or per capita income, growth rates, etc., are gender blind. So, feminist scholars have pushed for various kinds of gender indices. And the UNDP, the United Nations Development Program, has over a period of time since the publication of its first Human Development Report in 1990 come up with various gender disaggregated indicators, and they have become central to understanding of power relations and gender relations within the household as well as the society at large. So, disaggregating core human development indicators by sex and composing various gender related indices are one of the biggest contributions to feminist economics and the domain and the discipline of economics in general. So, we have gender related development indices. We have gender development index, we have inequality adjusted gender development index, there are gender empowerment measures, we also have gender inequality in education, gender inequality in economic activity, gender, work burden and time allocation, and women's political participation. Now, these are not merely indices because we are collecting a lot of information by by gender disaggregation, and this gives us a sneak peek into what is actually happening within the community, what is happening within the households, and this changes our entire thinking about how we want to think about different gaps that exist. For example, we think about education gaps, we can think about labor force participation gaps, we can think about political representation. Because feminist economists here are also asking, is empowerment only about income or also about voice, agency, dignity, and control? Now, this is where Naila Kabir's framework also becomes extremely important. We'll go to that in a while. But in continuation of the gender sensitive indicators, there is a lot of work on gender informed poverty analysis, which has been prompted by various international work surrounding Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals. Many papers have been developed around poverty reduction strategies, and these have informed gendered poverty analysis coming from time poverty and time use surveys and so on. Now, in order to integrate gender into the poverty diagnostic stage of the poverty reduction strategy, we need to generate data on many dimensions of poverty, particularly on opportunities, capabilities, security, and empowerment. So, a study of gender dimensions of poverty and their measurement also helps us to inform an ongoing non conclusive debate on the relationship between poverty and gender inequality. And there is an expansive literature in this area where we look at poverty as a state, and poverty as a state of being, and poverty as a process. And feminist economists have laid a lot of stress on understanding poverty as a process. What are the processes that give rise to different states of poverty? Because this has required different kinds of studies at the macro and micro level, which are difficult to undertake as access to documentation of gender disaggregated context is very limited. And therefore, we need various field studies over a period of time. Many field studies have been documented in different countries of the world, which has also shifted our perspective about how we want to understand gendered aspects of poverty. So, this shifting policy approaches to women in development reflect contesting perspectives of what are relevant gender sensitive or women specific interventions. Are we talking about gender sensitive interventions, or we are only focusing on women as an important category and then looking at interventions? These are two different things altogether. When it comes to understanding power and power relations between women and men, Many feminist economists have had contributions. The most influential analysts in the domain of feminist economics is by Naila Kabir and Joe Roland. Now, they help us to understand power in four different ways. One is power over, which is controlling power, which may be responded to with compliance, resistance, or manipulation. Second is power to, which is generative or productive power, which creates new possibilities and actions without domination. Third is power with, which is a sense of the whole being greater than the sum of the individuals, and power from within, which is spiritual strength and uniqueness. Its basis is self-acceptance and self-respect. Now, in most of the international literature, when we talk about people's action or people-centered development, we are referring to power to and power from within. So, the deconstruction of power relations between men and women by feminist economists have given primacy to these concepts of power, which is power to and power from within, which actually gives rise to the agency aspect of human beings. We talk about be the change that you want to be. This is being derived from this conceptualization of power. Um, and this is extremely useful in policy analysis. For example, microcredit may increase power to, but not power over household decisions. Self help groups can build power with, education can build power from within. And feminist economists actually insist that in the study of society, in the study of economy, and how we want to understand the role of women in economy and society, the conceptualization of all of these power dimensions is very important, and we need to see which power goes with what. And this is an important area of study, and there's a lot of new research that needs to come in this area. Now, there are three dimensions that we need to explore as far as women's empowerment is concerned, and that is personal, relational, and collective. And if you look at the definitional issues surrounding the deconstruction of the notion of power, all of these dimensions become important. Of how the personal relations, relational aspects of the community, the society at large, collective action, all of these impact women's empowerment is a very important area of study. And there are many political philosophers and sociologists and economists who have been carrying out interdisciplinary work that has informed, that has rich information on how collective action works in this area. Now, when it comes to dimensions of poverty, again, there are certain set ways in which we operationalize these the studies. There are indicators of gender dimensions of poverty and their measurement. Now, uh, Sen talks about development as freedom or creation of opportunities, or poverty as lack of opportunities or lack of capabilities. Now, when you look at this framework, all of these can be measured in different ways, and the final result or the fine tuning of these ideas lies in how we want to measure these aspects. So, for example, in the dimension of poverty with respect to opportunities, the indicators that we can consider are time budget and time poverty, employment and labor force participation, capital and assets. Often, as economists, we face hurdles with respect to how we want to measure these different philosophical aspects of poverty as a state of being and poverty as processes. So, if we are looking at opportunities, capabilities, security, empowerment as different processes whose lack of or whose achievement can lead to well being, then we need to be able to understand how we want, what are the indicators that we want to consider as under these different dimensions of poverty, and how we can measure them. So, in the context of opportunities, we want to mostly focus on labor markets, and the measurement tools that we usually utilize are household surveys, direct observation, household and labor market surveys, records of credit and finance institutions, and so on. Now, in economics research, often what happens is we carry out we have these measurement tools, we list these indicators. However, we do not connect the indicators and the measurements and the assessments to different dimensions of poverty. And this is a translational gap that we have in development economics, which feminist economics helps us to bridge. Similarly, in the context of dimension of poverty, capabilities. Now, there is an entire literature on capability set. Various political philosophers and economists have contributed to this literature. But if we have to think in terms of operationalizing it, we can simply look at the different demographic indicators: infant mortality, life expectancy, or education achievements, health and nutrition achievements, various qualitative indicators of capabilities like culture, freedom, and autonomy. And we can come up with different assessments of how we want to look at the process of development or the process of poverty. And of course, we have to center stage gender in there. The different measurement tools that we have for this dimension are again household and health surveys. We can have clinical records, anthropometric studies can be carried out. Different We can have access to school records. We can carry out participant observation and national quality of life survey. In fact, some of the important national level databases that we have can help us to carry out this research. Similarly, with respect to the security aspect of poverty, we can look at economic vulnerability, exposure to violence, and social capital. There are assessment tools for established assessment tools for these in the form of household surveys and so on. With respect to empowerment, we can look at political empowerment, control over household resources. Here we can assess this aspect of poverty by looking at voting records, key informants, participant observation, household surveys, and so on. This is also another aspect of gender mainstreaming, because when we are looking at when we want to understand that, okay, we have moved from women in development to gender and development, we want to have gender sensitive indicators and so on, but how do we operationalize it? We have understood the basic framework about power relations, we have understood the basic framework about gender blind models, and we want to move towards gender aware models and so on, but how do we measure? And this question of measurement is answered by listing out different dimensions of poverty, and then creating different indicators within these dimensions of poverty, and moving towards a scientifically designed survey instruments, scientifically designed measurement tools, and carrying out these analysis. Now, there are various contesting perspectives with respect to mainstreaming. Now, often you'll see that we are sort of arguing about whether gender mainstreaming has led to has constrained the idea of gender empowerment. So there are some contesting perspectives with regard to mainstreaming versus women's empowerment. There are arguments posed by proponents of gender mainstreaming. They say that it is mainstreaming gender, or inventing instruments of gender mainstreaming is important because it is critical to effectively use global goals and recommendations for action in development cooperation. So, for example, if there is a certain ministry or a certain department at the state level that wants to carry out an intervention program at the district or at the panchayat level, at the village level, and so on, then the idea of gender mainstreaming is important because you want to be able to create resources, or you want to be able to allocate resources effectively at the grassroots level. So, in that sense, the idea of gender mainstreaming is important. The proponents argue that it is important to improve the focus on legally binding commitments through international conventions. One of the important conventions that we have is the CEDAW Convention, which is Convention on All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Now, this is a very important convention which created enabling conditions for women with respect to creating different kinds of capabilities. And in terms of mainstreaming gender, or designing different kinds of policy instruments or legal instruments for ensuring women's participation, these kinds of conventions are very important. It is important also to distinguish between general development problems and challenges specifically relating to the promotion of gender equality. For example, in the context of Assam, we often talk about floods. Now, floods, of course, impact different people differently. Now, when we are thinking about a flood rehabilitation program, let us say, then are we thinking about flood rehabilitation program by taking household as a unit of consumption and production? Or are we also thinking about different members within the household and how they have been impacted by the flood conditions, and then we plan the rehabilitation program? And this can be carried out across domains. So when we are thinking about education, we are thinking about health, we are thinking about agriculture, all of these require moving from a general development problem to looking at gender equality or gender specific issues. And of course, when we're talking about gender here, we are not necessarily only talking about men and women. We are talking about all genders. We're talking about all units of consumption and production, which is why I keep saying adult units and child units and so on. There are areas where change is needed because we need to regularly update gender equality policies. We need to have various kinds of institutional arrangements. We need to sharpen policy dialogue and sectoral approaches. We need to develop competence of human resource and different institutions involved in this process, as well as update methodologies and tools, etc. In the recent time, we have labor codes that have come up, and it is you can imagine talking about regular updating of gender equality policies. In this context, we need to understand how have these codes changed, how are they impacting men and women differently, how are they impacting men and women coming from different castes, class, religion, and different regions differently. There are arguments by proponents of women's empowerment. Here, the discussion is on how to understand women's situation, because here, women's empowerment is central to the discourse. And the argument against gender mainstreaming is that gender mainstreaming is basically a policy adopted from above, and progress in this matter will depend entirely on committed individuals. And gender agenda is often sidelined as a result of ambiguous strategies with particular implications for women's empowerment. But the women's empowerment discourse represents a different theoretical and political point of departure, because here structure and agency play a very important role. With regard to women's gender mainstreaming, we are looking at a political process, of course, but at a governmental process of how we want to push women's agenda. But when it comes to women's empowerment, we are restructuring, we are setting agenda, we are looking at agency and what is the important role that these aspects play in the society. And it is in this context that Kabir's conceptualization of empowerment is very important, because we are looking at different levels of empowerment. There are deeper levels of empowerment where we are looking at structural relations of class, caste, gender. There may be intermediate levels where we are looking at institutional rules and resources, or there may be immediate levels where we are looking at individual resources, agency, and achievement. Uh, there are various categories of composite indicators that can be used to measure empowerment as well. I'll highlight three sort of indicators. One is the direct evidence of empowerment. Here, the variables that are given greatest weight is devaluation of women, women's emancipation, reported sharing of roles and decision making, equality in marriage, financial autonomy. For example, reports of domestic violence, dowry paid at marriage, belief in daughters' education, freedom of movement, egalitarian gender roles, fewer grounds reported for justified divorce by husbands, currently controls the woman's earnings, and so on. These are direct evidence of empowerment, and many disciplines within the social sciences have carried out these kinds of analysis, and it is high time that economics as a discipline also integrates this analysis into our household analysis or different kinds of bargaining models. Similarly, we may want to understand what is the source of empowerment, whether participation in the modern sector is a source of empowerment, whether lifetime exposure to employment is a source of empowerment. Here, we can create different indices of assets owned, female education, whether the individual worked before marriage, whether the individual is allowed to work before marriage, what is the control that this individual has over her earnings before marriage and after marriage, and so on. These can also give us very rich analysis with regard to women's empowerment. Similarly, setting of indicators, family structure amenable to empowerment. What is the family structure within which the married woman or the unmarried woman lives in? What is the marital advantage? What is the traditional marriage looking like? whether the for example, does the woman now or previously have lived with the in-laws? Is there a small age difference between spouses, whether the woman has chosen the husband or not? Is there a large educational difference with husband or did not choose husband? These are all very important examples that can give us a view about what variables to be considered and how it can inform the indicators and dimensions of women's empowerment. So let us close this session with a final slide on what is feminist economics doing in policy and practice. It is basically redefining what counts as work, it is redefining what counts as productivity, what counts as poverty, what counts as development, and it is challenging power relations embedded in institutions. So, in short, feminist economics is not a women's add on, it is a restructuring of economic thought and policy from the ground up. For this lecture, I have used a number of references. One of the primary references is by Britta Mickelson, which is Methods for Development Work and Research, a new guide for practitioners. This book introduces you to various operational frameworks that can be used in research where we want to center stage gender in economic analysis. And there are a few materials that I have used for highlighting the gender sensitive indicators and the gender analysis frameworks that are also showing on your slide. An interested student who is interested in research in this area is strongly advised to look up these references. Thank you. It was a pleasure taking this course.